you could call it an anti-Trump policy. It's the idea is to safeguard Canada's economy as much as you possibly can to insulate it from the impact of tariffs. So, and it's also an anti-Trump policy in that it's advocating for free trade.
Hi, I'm Fergus Macphee, and welcome to the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday to Friday, on our YouTube channel, and you can also listen and follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. Joining me today is Graham Lanktree, senior trade reporter at Politico. Graham, thank you so much for coming on the Trump Report. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on, Fergus.
Well, we're speaking today because you have co-authored an exclusive piece in Politico, which claims that Canada and its Prime Minister, Mark Carney, they're sort of leading discussions between the EU and another 12-nation bloc of Indo-Pacific countries. Those include Mexico, Japan, Australia, Malaysia, and Singapore, to form what would be one of the largest economic alliances in the world. I've got quite a few questions about it, but just briefly explain to me kind of why this is happening and a little bit about the piece.
Yeah, well, in the wake of the Trump Liberation Day tariffs last year, the EU and this trade bloc that's on the other side of the world, it includes it's a tongue-twisting name. It's the CPTPP. And it's like the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. And it's something that was formed in 2018. It began being ratified by a number of the 12 nations that are part of it. The UK actually joined at the end of 2024. And it's something that's kind of come to the fore of the kind of like trade discussion in the wake of all of Trump's tariff actions, just because it brings together a number of different nations like Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Peru, Chile. I could go on and on. Canada's part of it as well, but it's a lot of nations that adhere to the kind of like the old rules-based international trade order that's kind of embodied by the WTO, which at the moment has a lot of problems, and people see it as a kind of plan B to that.
And a lot of the way it's been framed so far is this is a direct response and this is sort of fighting back to Trump's tariffs. Is it just that, or is there more to it?
Yeah, the political discussions have really kind of coalesced around that. There's a number of things that are going on with trade. Like the EU just struck a trade deal with India at the beginning of the year, and the UK struck one with India last year. India is a notoriously difficult negotiator, and they don't do a lot of trade deals. They don't do them lightly. And so you see a number of things around the world where nations that really wouldn't have kind of taken that plunge in the past are really like working together on trade issues. And yeah, that EU discussion with these CPTPP nations was the impetus behind it is really the kind of Trump tariffs, which, people talk about how they're still going to be around even after this Trump administration ends. They will still be in place, and it would be difficult for another president to actually like dismantle a lot of those things that have been built up. So yeah, these conversations are something that has really kind of started around that. And at the end of last year, the EU and the CPTPP nations got together in Melbourne, Australia, and they actually like came out with a joint statement. They were having discussions and said, well, what can we do together around trade to kind of like push back on this? And they came out with this statement just saying, we'd like to do things on supply chain resilience. We'd like to do things on, trade diversification. Like in trade jargon, these are all kinds of like words that actually mean like, these nations working together on, trading goods, parts, components across borders, trading services more freely. So it's that's kind of what that means.
And because a lot of these, am I right in thinking that a lot of these countries, especially with the European Union, already have free trade agreements in place, but then this is something slightly different. This is kind of coalescing together.
Yeah, exactly. And what the story is about essentially is that apart from that statement that came out at the end of last year. Uh, they Canada is spearheading these efforts publicly to have what's called a rules of origin agreement, which, going back to what I was talking about with parts and components, it allows those things to kind of like travel across borders more freely, because rules of origin, it's another piece of trade jargon, but it basically defines what the nationality of a good is. So if it's got 50, if your good, your end product has like 50% components from Vietnam and 40% components from, I don't know, Australia, and the other 10% is from a couple other different nations. Where does that good come from? People might kind of think about, well, where does that come from? And that's what tariffs hit. And so this agreement would allow all of those nations together to kind of like pool their resources, and those goods would be able to kind of travel across borders a lot more freely, without facing as many tariffs.
And in practice, I think the number that's quoted, it would sort of make up 1.5 sort of billion people, those countries. How significant do you think it is in practice?
Uh, well, I mean, that's what Mark Carney said during his Davos speech, where he was talking about middle powers pushing back against trade coercion, another code word for like Trump's tariffs, as well as China, and I mean that would be the size of the if they did a kind of like free trade agreement together, that would be the size of the market of all of those countries together. I suppose rules of origin are a very like a narrow rules of origin deal could also give access to a market of that many people. And that's really what we're talking about in this instance. It's not a free trade agreement per se. It's this rules of origin deal, and that's really specific to goods. It wouldn't be for like services. But yeah, I mean, it's a huge opportunity. I mean, like all of these nations together. I mean, it's about 40 nations. Um, and there are some other rules of origin pacts throughout the world. There's one in Europe and the Mediterranean, which I think has more nations that are part of it. But this would rank amongst one of the largest trade agreements in the entire world, and in history.
Last week at the Munich Security Conference, the big line from Friedrich Merz was that the kind of rules-based order that we've seen from the end of World War II no longer exists. You just mentioned there, obviously, Mark Carney at Davos last year month talked about middle powers. Are we kind of seeing that same thing happening with a redrawing of the global economic map?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, the EU is made up of a number of middle power nations, you could say. I mean, it's not China, it's not the United States, which are both like the world superpowers and hegemons at the moment. And so, an agreement between the CPTPP and EU is those middle powers getting together. And I think that's why, Prime Minister Carney has been so active on this issue. I mean, he's a couple weeks ago, like at the beginning of the month, he dispatched his personal representative to the European Union, a guy named John Hannaford, to Singapore to kind of like sound out leaders in the region. CPTPP nations specifically, Singapore is one, about doing this kind of deal. And then just last week, actually, his international trade minister, a guy named Menander Sidhu, he was over in Singapore and also Vietnam, which is another CPTPP nation, and he was talking about doing more on trade. And um, to get more technical and complicated, Vietnam is the chair of the CPTPP group this year. It's a kind of like rotating chair. Australia had it last year. And Vietnam is chairing it this year. And so that's why he traveled to Vietnam, which was really to kind of like push the kind of Canadian agenda. And in the kind of like press release that came out beforehand, it said that he was like supporting Vietnam's, chairship of CPTPP. But if you read between the lines, this is what he's going to do, is going on this kind of very like active push to raise this up the agenda. um,
Is is the election of Mark Carney one of Donald Trump's kind of biggest fumbles as a politician?
yeah, he took a lot of credit for it, which I don't think.
I know Mark Carney obviously has Canada. I'm sure he has Canada's best interests at heart, but this is kind of another example of him almost actively pursuing, sort of maybe not anti-Trump policy, but you see what I'm getting at.
Oh no, no, exactly. I mean, it's a policy that is pushing back on the tariffs. I mean, you could call it an anti-Trump policy. It's the idea is to safeguard Canada's economy as much as you possibly can to insulate it from the impact of tariffs. So, and it's also an anti-Trump policy in that it's advocating for free trade. It's not it's not protectionist. It's calling for more open free trade globally. And yeah, I mean, Trump took a lot of credit for Carney's election, with good reason. There was actually, the president takes credit for a lot of things, but he could genuinely take credit for that.
I wonder how Pierre Poilievre is feeling right now.
Well, he's escaped to like a safe seat out in Alberta, and he remains the leader of the Conservative Party, even though he lost the last election. And yeah, I mean, he's probably a bit dismayed about it. Maybe Trump regrets it. But yeah, Carney has been quite, I guess, muscular on the world stage. I mean, that Davos speech has, I think, become somewhat historic, that nations throughout the world took notice of it. um, Business people throughout the world took notice of it. And you like throughout Whitehall here in London, you hear everybody talking about it. Different embassies, high commissions, it's something that's been on everybody's lips, basically since it happened.
Is that obviously trade is your beat? Is that surprising to you? You've seen this kind of coalescing between these middle countries.
Well, I guess because it's been a kind of slow process that I've been tracking since it really began at the beginning of last year. It was something that was actually spearheaded. The initial conversations between CPTPP and the EU were spearheaded by Chris Luxon, who is New Zealand's prime minister, and he came to the UK early last year after having a number of conversations with EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, and then pitched Keir Starmer on it. And then Trade Secretary Jonathan Reynolds talked about it at a private reception that was held to kind of mark the Prime Minister Luxon's visit to London, talking about how the UK is keen on it. I think the UK actually remains keen on it. It's something that you won't see ministers come out and talk publicly about it quite a lot. The government is very reticent to kind of anger Trump in any way. Even though you saw them yesterday sign a energy deal with Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, which then Trump immediately came out and said was inappropriate. They just don't want to be seen to be rocking the boat. But it's something that people in Whitehall are talking about, and it's gaining a lot more steam. Business. And here I'm talking about this EU CPTPP relationship. The British businesses are behind it, and I think their voices are getting louder within government that they really want to see. As Number Ten's relationship with the EU becomes closer and closer, doing something like this is just a natural kind of extension of that.
And like some people have been quick to call it an anti-Trump alliance, right? Um, I guess the issue with that is that obviously he's not going to be here as president forever. But what you're just saying there is this very much kind of a long term thing, even when Trump is no longer in office.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I think there was an interview at the end of last year that Biden's Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo did with a think tank, where she was talking about how she believed that the Trump tariffs would outlive his presidency. It's just very difficult to like roll some of these things back. I mean, even the first Trump administration's trade restrictions on China, they remained largely in place afterwards. And even though the relationship with the UK became better with respect to trade, the Biden administration still didn't do a trade deal with the UK that was promised under Boris Johnson with the first Trump administration. Even despite the fact that the UK still wanted that, and I mean the one that they've got now with the president. I mean that will endure, right? Because it's taking some kind of legal form that these are treaties. These are treaties, and when it goes from like one government to another, the treaties remain in place unless they're dissolved by you know uh, one or other of the parties or by mutual consent. So yeah, I think that it would also be a very large project to like roll back a lot of the Trump tariffs. You would spend a lot of policy hours doing that. It would have to be like one of your campaign planks. I'm getting rid of the tariffs, and then
And again, at Davos last month, Mark Carney, I think the words he used was that the world was in the midst of a rupture and not a transition. So, I mean, he sounded pretty sure then that things are not necessarily going to go back to the way they were.
right, yeah, exactly. I mean, uh, to also use the example of like the World Trade Organization, there was continuity between the first Trump administration and the Biden administration when it came to like there's this appellate body which kind of like is the judicial system within the WTO for like trade disputes, and that's been frozen since about 2018, 2019. I might be getting my years wrong, but under the first Trump administration, the U.S. basically blocked the appointment of any new judges to that body, basically creating. They were no longer able to form a quorum, and so it's basically been out of operation, since then. We're going on like it'll be a decade in a couple of years. And so, I mean, that's part of what's going on. Like the WTO next month is going to have a big meeting where they're going to talk about, how do we get out of this situation? Can we get back to a point where we're actually like able to resolve trade disputes between different members within this global body? And there's a lot of doubts about whether or not they'll be able to do it because the past couple meetings they just haven't been able to reach. They've said that they were committed to resolving that issue, and they just haven't been able to.
Well, I think I saw some sort of skeptical voice saying that in an era of great powers, if that is what we're in, where is there space for things like the WTO?
I mean, it's a good question. The trade system is fragmenting. It's breaking down. There's a lot of I don't have the statistics close to hand, but I've heard the WTO Director General Ngozi talk about how there's so many more protectionist measures in different countries across the world, in the past like 5 years than there were in the previous five or the previous decade. Um, and so there's more protectionist measures that are taking shape, and it seems as though that's something of a more long-term trend. And with these the Trump tariffs remaining in place and other people bringing in their own protectionist measures. I mean, you see in the EU right now, or even in the UK, they're bringing in different things like, you know, to get even back to technicalities. Trade is just like a super technical thing, which it can be really annoying, and it makes it very difficult to kind of like, communicate, important issues with the public. But the EU and the UK are bringing in something called a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is just like a tax on high emissions commodities at the border. Because here in the UK and in the EU, you have to like meet these carbon targets for your emissions for manufacturing. And if you're competing against like an Indian firm or a Chinese firm that just doesn't have to meet those same emission standards and have to like, pour that investment and money into your factories to make them cleaner, then you're on a kind of uncompetitive footing with them. So the EU and the UK are bringing in these taxes that will kind of like, they promise to level the playing field. But this is also a protectionist measure, to get back to what I was talking about. So, there's all sorts of things like that. And it's not just like the EU that's like bringing in these things. It's also the UK. And then there's other nations throughout the world that are, bringing in industrial policies. Or like, if you look at China, they've got massive subsidies for all kinds of industries, whether it's like solar panels or electric vehicles. And, those goods are then leaving those factories, and they're, coming into markets in the West, and they're making basically Western automotive industry completely uncompetitive, and it's going to decimate it.
I just want, yeah, it's a final point for any sort of, again, skeptics that might be watching. With that, with what sort of Mark Carney talks about the middle powers, and if this new sort of trade alliance does happen, with any sort of large scale alliance, do you need a country like a US, a China, or an India?
Oh, to be part of that group of nations? No, I don't think so. Not necessarily. Although, I mean, if you look within CPTPP, there's definitely like some of the larger nations like Japan, which is part of it, Australia, Canada, some of the larger economies, they tend to kind of like, hold a little bit more sway. But the thing about CPTPP also, this is also something that is part of the WTO, is that it works with on consensus. So all the different nations that are part of it need to agree on positions going forward. It also makes it difficult to reach consensus. Um, because there might be disagreements between different members. And as that group of nations becomes larger and expands, there's a number of nations like the UAE, the Philippines, Indonesia that have applied to join, and their applications are being considered. Expanding that group, you go from like 12 to like 15, 16. It becomes more difficult to kind of reach consensus. But with the EU, we're not talking about reaching consensus. They're just going to like do a deal, and the CPTPP nations would need to agree on whatever that deal is. And the EU would have to agree on their part of the deal as well. And they won't have to like reach consensus as 40 nations or anything like that. But yeah, I mean, it does become difficult, and that's why it's going to be hard to do this deal, actually, this rules of origin deal. It's not something that's going to happen like probably this year, maybe not even next year. I don't know. But they're getting the ball rolling, and they want to have this conversation, and they're thinking long term about what is going to kind of like preserve trade. And we want to work with a fast growing area of the world. Asia is just booming in terms of like GDP growth annually. I mean, it's just rocketing. These nations have like 6% GDP growth, and then you look at like the UK, it's like 1.2%. So yeah, so it's quite large, but there's a lot of opportunity there. And I think there's also probably a lot of opportunity for them working with the West as well.
Graham Lanktree, thank you so much for joining us on the Trump Report and helping us to understand some of the complexities of global trade.
Very welcome.